So in this lecture, we're going to explore the background to modern theology. Modernity describes this shift in worldview from a previous perspective. And it's within this shift of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason that modern theology emerges. There's several key characteristics which define modernity. First, modern theology is characterized by philosophical rationalism. Now, rationalism rose to prominence under the philosopher Descartes. Rationalism is this expectation that autonomous human reason can provide certain knowledge. Notice that now, under philosophical rationalism, it's the individual human person who's the seat of knowledge. Certain knowledge resides in the self. The second characteristic of modernity is skepticism. In modernity, there's this widespread suspicion of religious authority. There's this expectation that religious authority, which includes divine revelation and the church tradition, that this authority cannot provide true knowledge. Here we can think of Kant's rejection of metaphysics and also Kant's denial of the traditional proofs of God. These sorts of ideas really pushed and motivated this sort of skepticism among modern thinkers. The third characteristic of modernity is naturalism, which is sometimes called scientism. Now, naturalism is the belief that every single thing in the world is a result of natural law. Naturalism questioned the very possibility of the divine, of providence, of the supernatural, things such as miracles. Under naturalism, God is no longer needed to explain the universe. The fourth characteristic is secularism. Under secularism, reason supersedes revelation. The state and society, which were once subsumed under the authority of the church, are now removed. The church, in turn, lost power. So in today's lecture, we're going to look at the scientific and philosophical movements that paved the way for the modern period. We're going to see how these four characteristics developed. Modern theology is greatly shaped by the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Enlightenment was birthed in these two pillars. First, Descartes' philosophical rationalism, and second, the scientific revolution. And your key figures are Galileo and Newton. So first, let's look at the philosophical revolution of Descartes. The French philosopher Descartes, he sought knowledge outside of faith and outside of revelation. He sought knowledge outside of sense perception. That is what we can experience. His basic idea here is that sure and certain knowledge is possible. Now, if such knowledge were to exist, it could provide the foundation for all knowledge. So it could provide the foundation for both scientific and religious knowledge. Now, we find Descartes' basic method in his book, Discourse on Method. He begins this work by doubting everything, in all sense perception, all religious and scientific knowledge, in an effort to arrive at some form of knowledge that is beyond these things. This is what he says. Thus, as our senses deceive us at times, I was ready to suppose that nothing was at all the way our senses represented them to be. Finally, as the same percepts which we have when awake may come to us when asleep, without their being true, I decided to suppose that nothing that had ever entered my mind was more real than the illusion of my dreams. But I soon noticed that while I thus wished to think everything false, it was necessarily true that I who thought so was something. Since this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and assured that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were unable to shake it. I judged that I could safely accept it as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. Here we find Descartes' famous statement, I think, therefore I am. Descartes grounded certain, sure knowledge in the mind's reason. Descartes' intention was not to undermine faith or religious belief, but rather he aimed to set it on this proper footing or foundation. In fact, After Descartes proved the existence of the self, he proceeded to demonstrate and prove God's existence. Descartes remained a faithful Roman Catholic until his death. But there's a significant difference between Descartes and the apologists who preceded him. Descartes grounded God's existence in the existence of the self. Notice the order there. Traditional apologetics grounds knowledge of God in revelation, whether natural revelation in creation or supernatural revelation in Holy Scripture. Nevertheless, for Descartes, God explains the existence of the world. Descartes marks this philosophical transition. Before Descartes, all philosophers were theologians. Theology was considered to be the queen of the sciences, and so all other fields of knowledge were in some way related to theology. Descartes' approach, it marked a significant departure from this earlier tradition. He sought to ground knowledge in reason rather than in faith or revelation, and this approach paved the way for a new era of philosophical thinking, and this era would come to define the Enlightenment. The self becomes the seat of knowledge. Now, let's explore the second pillar of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution. Prior to the Age of Reason, it was the opinion of nearly all people that creation was ordered and sustained supernaturally by God. Pretty much everyone, believed that the earth was the center of the universe. This was backed by some passages in Scripture. In Psalm 104, we read, "He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved." Scientific discoveries provided an alternative explanation to how this passage in particular was viewed. The earth revolved around the sun. Now, under this understanding, God was not required to explain the universe. For those who interpreted Scripture to support this view of the universe, it naturally led them to question whether Scripture could be wrong in other areas as well. For the church, science seemed to reject the ecclesial authority, the authority of the church. Now, in the 16th century, Galileo proved that the earth is not the center of the universe. Galileo's discovery was viewed as this religious attack. Galileo's books were banned and he was forbidden to publish any more. The church's harsh response was devastating to its witness. This response led many to question the authority and reliability of the church. Why should anyone trust the institution of the church after its harsh treatment of Galileo? Galileo's discovery then ushered in this war, or this supposed conflict between science and faith. This conflict continues to the present day. A second key figure in the scientific revolution is Isaac Newton. Now, Newton's law of gravity offered a way of understanding the universe that did not require God. Many of the things in the universe that were once attributed to divine supernatural powers could now be attributed to this law of gravity. Now, Newton didn't think that gravity necessarily ruled out the possibility of miracles or divine action, but many of those who followed Newton did. And because of this, Newton's discoveries raised these further questions about how to reconcile faith and science. The scientific revolution had catastrophic consequences for the church and for the Christian faith. First, it threatened to crowd out God. Much of the world could now be explained without appeal to the supernatural. And second, it closed off the material world from God. It created a sort of barrier. Not only is the world explainable without God, but it seems that God cannot act supernaturally within the world against the laws of nature. This forced theologians to rethink what do we mean when we talk about miracles? And it forced them to develop new ways of understanding this relationship between faith and science. Now, as we end our time here, I want to ask this very important question. Why study modern theology? Why spend an entire semester studying modern thought? Well, the modern period is quite interesting. It's fascinating, really, for several reasons. But it's not so much that the modern period gives us the foundation of Christian thought. Many doctrines, think of Christology and the Trinity, justification. These were hammered out in the early patristic councils and creeds. the first few centuries of the church. It's also, the modern period doesn't give us shape to the Protestant tradition. No, the Protestant tradition was birthed in the Reformation with folks like Luther and Calvin and Zwingli. The significance of the modern period lies elsewhere. Modernity shapes the culture of the contemporary church. See, the way we experience and think about the world has been deeply shaped by the Enlightenment. As contemporary Christians, many of the questions that we take for granted were birthed over the last few hundred of years. Here's a few of the questions that have really crystallized during this period. First, there's the problem of religious authority. Now, philosophical movements questioned the church's authority. Descartes replaced the authority of the church and its tradition and divine revelation with, again, the thinking self. The I think, therefore I am. And Kant, who we're going to look at in a future lecture, he denied metaphysics and the ability to prove God through reason. A second question, modernity started or initiated the critical study of the Bible. Now, when we think of the quest for the historical Jesus and higher biblical criticism, these were all birthed in the Enlightenment. There's a third question of the study of church history and how doctrine developed. And a fourth question, modernity raised this question of the conflict between science and faith. Science seemed to close off the material world from God. The shift in worldview that modernity birthed changed the landscape of theology. Each of these problems required some sort of a response. Theologians asked the question of, how can we as theologians, as ministers of the gospel, respond to these challenges? How can Christian theology speak faithfully amidst the skepticism towards religious authority? Think of 1 Peter 3:15. It says, "But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make an offense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect." See, this verse emphasizes the need for readiness and preparedness for us as Christians to give a defense of our faith. We're called to engage others, addressing their questions and doubts, while exemplifying this character of Christ, of gentleness and of respect. We read something similar in Colossians 4, 5, and 6. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. The Christian response to the Enlightenment should be marked by wisdom and discernment. As Christians, we are called to be aware of the current cultural, intellectual, and spiritual contexts so that we can share the gospel. In the modern world, we encounter diverse belief systems. We see skepticism, and we see and come across questions that challenge our faith. Studying modern theology allows us to explore these issues, understand their historical context, and engage with the ongoing conversation between faith and culture. It allows us to be prepared to give a defense of our faith. By grappling with the theological implications of modernity, we can better navigate our contemporary world and contribute to the development of a robust and relevant theology for our time.